Have you ever met someone who seems to know everyone on the planet? Now imagine that person living in Hollywood. That's Chris Tucker. Mention almost any celebrity, world leader, or music legend, and chances are Chris doesn't just know them, he has a hilarious story about them. But what's even funnier is that none of this success changed his personality. When Chris became one of Hollywood's highest paid actors, people expected his family to celebrate. They definitely did, maybe a little too much. Chris has joked that the moment his relatives heard how much money he was making, they suddenly had a very interesting career plan. Quit their jobs. Everyone seemed convinced that Chris's success automatically belonged to the whole family. Instead of quietly accepting it, he turned the situation into one of his most famous comedy stories, laughing that he had to remind everyone of one important detail. I'm rich, not all of us. That ability to laugh at his own life is exactly what made audiences fall in love with him. Long before Hollywood, long before Rush Hour, Chris Tucker was already making people laugh. Growing up in Georgia, school wasn't exactly his favorite place. Teachers constantly warned him that if he didn't stop joking around, they'd call his mother. Chris's response? He'd jokingly tell them they might have to pay the phone bill first because the family phone had already been disconnected. Even getting sent to the principal's office wasn't a punishment anymore. He had been there so many times that he joked he and the principal had practically become friends. Looking back now, those childhood stories sound less like trouble and more like the early rehearsals of a future stand-up comedian. No one imagined that the class clown would eventually become one of the biggest comedy stars in the world. And that was only the beginning, because once Chris entered Hollywood, his life became stranger than any movie script. In fact, before long, he wasn't just meeting celebrities. He was becoming close friends with some of the most famous people to ever live. And one friendship in particular would completely surprise the world. Next, Chris Tucker and Michael Jackson. If there was one celebrity Chris Tucker was constantly linked to, it was Michael Jackson. At first, many people assumed they only met a few times, but behind the scenes, they developed a genuine friendship that lasted for years. And according to Chris, spending time with Michael was never normal. Going to the movies? For most people, that's simple. Buy a ticket, grab some popcorn, find your seat. But when your movie partner is the biggest pop star on earth, nothing is simple. Chris has explained that Michael hated attracting attention. He wanted to experience life like everyone else. So whenever they planned to watch a movie together, the entire trip became a carefully planned mission. Michael would often arrive at the theater just moments before the film started, hoping no one would recognize him. For a few minutes, everything would seem perfectly normal. Then something unexpected would happen. Michael would get completely absorbed in the movie. He'd laugh loudly, react to dramatic scenes, sometimes even talk back to the screen. Chris found it hilarious. The very thing Michael was trying to avoid, people noticing him, became impossible once the movie started. Even when no one had recognized him walking in, his excitement could quickly give him away. But perhaps the funniest story happened during a shopping trip. Michael suddenly decided he wanted to visit a mall like everyone else. Chris immediately reminded him of the obvious problem. You know you're Michael Jackson, right? Michael reportedly believed he had the perfect solution, a disguise. Unfortunately, the only disguise available was a Spider-Man mask. For a brief moment, it actually seemed to work. People glanced at them but kept walking. Then someone noticed Chris Tucker, and that's when everything changed. If Chris Tucker was standing next to Spider-Man, there was only one possible explanation. The man inside the mask had to be Michael Jackson. Within seconds, curious shoppers gathered. More people arrived. The crowd grew larger and larger. What started as a quiet shopping trip quickly turned into complete chaos. Chris would later laugh about the entire experience, saying Michael genuinely believed the disguise would fool everyone. Despite moments like these, Chris always described Michael as incredibly generous and kind, not because of his fame, not because of his success, but because of how he treated people behind closed doors. And that generosity would soon lead to one of the funniest stories Chris has ever told. A simple compliment, a luxury gift, and one request that finally made Michael say, no. Coming up next, the unbelievable gift Michael Jackson gave Chris Tucker and the one gift he refused to give him.
By now, Chris Tucker had learned something unusual about Michael Jackson. If Michael heard you genuinely liked something, there was a good chance he'd simply give it to you. Not because anyone asked, not because he wanted attention. That was simply the kind of person he was. One day, Chris was visiting Michael's home when something caught his eye. Mounted on the wall was an enormous flat-screen television. At the time, it was one of the most impressive TVs money could buy. Chris casually admired it. He mentioned how incredible it looked. That should have been the end of the conversation. Instead, Michael smiled. If you like it, you should take it. Chris laughed, assuming Michael was joking. He wasn't. Within minutes, staff members were already preparing the television to be delivered. Chris later admitted he never expected a simple compliment to turn into such an expensive gift, and that's when he realized something. Maybe complimenting Michael's belongings wasn't such a bad idea. So, naturally, the next time he visited, he started noticing a few more things. A beautiful painting, an elegant piece of furniture, luxury decorations. Each time, Michael would smile and ask the same question. You really like it? Chris joked that after a while, he found himself complimenting almost everything in the house. Then, he decided to test the limits. Parked outside was a stunning Rolls-Royce. Not just any luxury car, one of the newest models available. Chris walked around it, shaking his head in admiration. Now that's an incredible car. Michael looked at him with a smile. You really like it? Chris answered without hesitation. Absolutely. For a brief second, he wondered if history was about to repeat itself. Then Michael laughed. You'd better go buy your own. Both of them burst into laughter. Even Michael had his limits. It became one of Chris Tucker's favorite stories because it perfectly captured Michael's personality. Kind, generous, but also incredibly funny. Their friendship only grew stronger after that. In fact, Chris once spent an unbelievable amount of money just for the chance to see Michael. He had already flown across the country on a private jet. After waiting without hearing back, he assumed Michael was unavailable, so he boarded another flight home. The moment he landed, a message finally arrived. Michael wanted to meet him, back in New York. Most people would have accepted the bad timing and stayed home. Chris didn't even think twice. He turned around, got back on another private jet, and flew all the way back. When people later asked why anyone would spend so much money on a single trip, Chris's answer was simple. You don't say no to a chance to spend time with Michael Jackson. And if you thought Michael Jackson was the most unusual celebrity in Chris Tucker's life, wait until you hear what happened when he met the mysterious music legend. If spending time with Michael Jackson sounded unbelievable, meeting Prince was an entirely different experience. Prince was known as one of the most private and mysterious artists in music history. Very few people ever got to see what he was like behind closed doors. Chris Tucker was one of those lucky few. According to Chris, Prince wasn't loud or outgoing. He was incredibly quiet. In fact, during their first meeting, Prince didn't even call Chris's name. Instead, he stood nearby trying to get his attention in the most subtle way possible. Chris kept hearing a strange little sound behind him. He looked around, completely confused. Finally, someone whispered, "Prince is trying to get your attention." Chris turned around and greeted him, and within seconds, the awkward silence turned into laughter. Prince had a personality that completely surprised him. On stage, he looked fearless. Off stage, he was soft-spoken, shy, and almost impossible to read. It reminded Chris that the biggest stars often behave nothing like the public imagines. But while Prince was mysterious, Jackie Chan was the exact opposite. The moment Chris arrived on the set of Rush Hour, Jackie made him feel like family. Every single day, Chris would return to his trailer and find another gift waiting for him. Sometimes it was clothing, sometimes it was artwork, sometimes it was something completely unexpected. At first, Chris felt grateful. Then he started feeling guilty. He realized Jackie had been giving him presents almost every day, and he hadn't given anything back. So Chris decided it was finally his turn. He bought Jackie an expensive gift. Jackie smiled politely, but Chris soon discovered something hilarious. Jackie had easy access to many of the items Chris was buying. Chris joked that he had probably spent far more money trying to repay the kindness than Jackie had spent in the first place. That became one of the running jokes between them. Their chemistry off camera turned into the same chemistry audiences saw on screen. That's one of the reasons Rush Hour felt so natural. They weren't pretending to enjoy each other's company, they genuinely did. Even years later, Chris continued describing Jackie as one of the kindest people he'd ever met, and eventually, two of his worlds almost collided. Michael Jackson wanted to meet Jackie Chan. Chris couldn't believe two of his closest friends admired each other so much. When they finally connected, Chris watched two global icons greet each other with the excitement of lifelong fans. It was one of those surreal Hollywood moments that reminded him how small the entertainment world could be. But as incredible as those friendships were, Chris Tucker's funniest stories were still ahead, because his adventures with presidents, billionaires, movie stars, and world-famous athletes would prove that sometimes real life is much stranger than comedy. Coming up next, Ferraris, presidents, and the unbelievable celebrity stories that sound too crazy to be true. By the time Chris Tucker became one of Hollywood's biggest stars, his contact list looked almost unbelievable. Movie legends, music icons, world leaders. It seemed like no matter where he traveled, there was always another incredible story waiting to happen. One of those stories began with a simple question. What happens if you ask another celebrity to borrow their Ferrari? Most people wouldn't even think about asking. Chris, did his friend, actor Charlie Sheen, owned a beautiful Ferrari. Without hesitation, Chris jokingly asked if he could borrow it. To his surprise, Charlie simply handed him the keys. No paperwork, no conditions, just one friend trusting another. Chris expected to keep it for a short time. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. Eventually, Charlie had to call him, "So, are you planning to bring my Ferrari back?" Chris laughed, because he had almost forgotten it wasn't his anymore. Stories like that became a perfect example of how unusual life had become, but nothing compared to traveling with a former president of the United States. During one international trip, Chris had the opportunity to travel alongside Bill Clinton. At first, it felt like a normal diplomatic visit. Then, something unexpected happened. Chris started doing a funny impression of Clinton's voice. Everyone nearby laughed. Even President Clinton himself couldn't stop smiling. Instead of asking Chris to stop, he wanted to hear more. Everywhere they went, Clinton would introduce Chris to new people and ask him to perform the impression again. At dinners, private meetings, even official events. The impression became part of the trip. Chris joked that the pressure kept growing because each audience became more important than the last. Finally, they reached another formal meeting with national leaders. Clinton looked at Chris and smiled. "Go ahead, do it again." Chris froze. This wasn't a comedy club. This wasn't a television interview. These were world leaders. For a brief moment, he wondered if making the wrong joke might become an international incident. Thankfully, everyone laughed. The room relaxed instantly. Chris realized something powerful that day. Laughter speaks every language, whether you're performing in a comedy club, talking to movie stars, or standing beside presidents. A genuine laugh has the ability to connect people from completely different worlds. But despite meeting some of the most powerful people on earth, Chris would soon discover that fame doesn't always guarantee recognition. In one country, people had absolutely no idea who he was. In fact, they thought he was someone else entirely. By the mid-2000s, Chris Tucker was one of the biggest movie stars in the world. Rush Hour had become a global hit. His face was everywhere, or at least that's what he thought. Then he landed in Hong Kong. Chris expected fans to recognize him immediately. After all, the Rush Hour movies were incredibly popular across Asia. Instead, something completely unexpected happened. People kept staring at him. They rushed over with huge smiles. Phones and cameras came out. For a second, Chris thought they wanted his autograph, but then someone shouted a name that made him stop in his tracks. "Kobe!" Another voice yelled. "Kobe Bryant!" Within moments, more people joined in. Everyone seemed convinced they were standing in front of the NBA legend. Chris couldn't help laughing. He tried explaining who he really was, but the excitement only grew. Some people even asked him to sign as Kobe. It became one of his favorite travel stories, because it reminded him that fame can be very different depending on where you are in the world. Back home in Atlanta, things weren't much easier. Chris loved living there because it felt more relaxed than Hollywood. He could shop for groceries, visit restaurants, and spend time with family. At least, that was the plan. Reality was a little different. Every trip to the grocery store turned into the same conversation. People would stare for a moment before walking over. "Chris, is that really you?" He always laughed and answered, "Yeah, it's really me." Then came the question he never understood. "What are you doing here?" Chris's response was priceless. "What do you mean, what am I doing here? I have to eat just like everybody else." Moments like that reminded him how strange celebrity life could be. To many people, famous actors almost seem like superheroes. They forget that celebrities still buy groceries, wait in line, and live ordinary lives between movie sets. Even getting pulled over by police became comedy material. Chris loved joking about traffic stops. He imagined officers hiding behind trees for hours, simply waiting for someone to drive a little too fast. Instead of getting angry, he turned those frustrating moments into stand-up routines that audiences couldn't stop laughing about. That ability to find humor in everyday life became one of his greatest strengths. Whether he was talking about airports, shopping, or traffic tickets, he always found a way to make ordinary experiences feel unforgettable. But behind every joke, there was one person Chris could never fool. One person who treated him exactly the same before fame and after millions of dollars, his mother. And according to Chris, she never cared how famous he became. For all the blockbuster movies, the private jets, and the famous friends, there was one group of people who never let Chris Tucker forget where he came from, his family. No matter how successful he became, they treated him like the same kid from Georgia. And honestly, Chris wouldn't have wanted it any other way. One of his funniest stories begins right after he became one of the highest paid actors in Hollywood. Suddenly, everyone in the family seemed to have a new plan. Some relatives joked about quitting their jobs. Others assumed Chris would take care of everything. Chris laughed about it on stage, saying he had to remind everyone of one very important fact. "Just because I became rich doesn't mean everybody became rich." The audience exploded with laughter because almost everyone could relate. Success has a funny way of changing other people's expectations, but Chris never spoke about it with anger. He turned it into comedy. That was his gift, finding humor where most people would only find stress. Then there was his mother. According to Chris, she was the one person who simply couldn't be impressed. Movie star? Didn't matter. Millionaire? Didn't matter. To her, he was still just her son. Growing up, Sunday mornings followed one rule. Everyone went to church, no excuses. Chris loved joking about how impossible it was to negotiate with his mother. No matter how tired anyone felt, no matter what happened the night before, Sunday meant church, and if you complained, you only made things worse. Years later, he transformed those childhood memories into some of his funniest stand-up routines. Fans laughed because the stories felt real. Almost everyone had experienced a strict parent who refused to change the rules. Even after becoming famous, Chris admitted there were moments when he still felt like that same kid, trying to avoid getting into trouble. His mother didn't care about Hollywood. She cared about respect, kindness, and staying humble. Those lessons stayed with him throughout his career. They helped explain why so many people who worked with Chris described him as approachable and genuine. Despite the money, the awards, and the worldwide fame, he never forgot where he started, and maybe that's why audiences continued connecting with him year after year, because behind the celebrity, there was still the same funny guy from Georgia who loved making people smile. But there was one final story, a story so unbelievable that Chris himself joked nobody would ever believe it. One evening, inside a private living room, he witnessed two of the greatest musical legends in history singing together just a few feet away from him, and according to Chris, the only other witness was a dog. After years of unforgettable moments with presidents, actors, and music legends, there was one memory Chris Tucker said stood above all the rest, not because it happened on a movie set, not because cameras were rolling, but because almost nobody else was there to witness it. One evening, Chris was invited to spend time with two of the greatest musicians in history, Michael Jackson and Barry Gibb of the Bee Gees. It wasn't a concert, it wasn't a rehearsal, just a quiet evening at home, watching television together. For Chris, simply sitting in the same room with two music icons already felt surreal. Then something happened that turned an ordinary night into a memory he would never forget. Someone casually mentioned one of the Bee Gees' biggest hits. A few seconds later, Barry Gibb softly began singing. Michael smiled, then joined in. Suddenly, two of the most recognizable voices in music history were performing together. No audience, no stage, no microphones, just two friends enjoying music for the love of it. Chris sat there in complete disbelief. He later joked that he kept looking around the room, wondering if anyone else was seeing what he was seeing. There was only one other witness, a dog. Chris laughed that even the dog looked surprised. It was one of those magical moments that could never be recreated. No cameras captured it, no recordings exist, only the memory remained. Looking back at his career, Chris Tucker has collected stories that sound almost impossible. Flying across the country just to see Michael Jackson, borrowing a Ferrari from Charlie Sheen, traveling with presidents, working alongside Jackie Chan, meeting Prince, laughing with some of the biggest names in entertainment. But if there's one thing every one of those stories has in common, it's that Chris never forgot how to laugh. Whether he was standing on a movie set, sharing a private joke with a music legend, or remembering his childhood in Georgia, he always found humor in every situation. Maybe that's the real reason audiences still love Chris Tucker today. Not just because he's funny, but because behind every joke is someone who never stopped being himself. And in an industry where almost everything changes, that may be his greatest success of all. If you enjoyed these unbelievable stories, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments which Chris Tucker story surprised you the most.